The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, pounding the landscape into a canvas of dust and cracked earth. Ethan Miller, a man whose face was as weathered as the land he now owned, watched the heat shimmer over the barren acres of Dry Creek Ranch. The deed was in his pocket, a crinkled piece of paper that felt more like a death sentence than an inheritance. His uncle Silas, a man he hadn't seen in over a decade, had left him this desolate plot, a collection of a rotting shack, a busted corral, and a few hundred acres of pure nothing. Ethan dismounted his horse, Ghost, the animal's coat a light grey that seemed to absorb the dust rather than repel it. The only sound was the wind, a lonely whisper carrying the scent of sagebrush and despair. His life had been a series of endings, each one leaving him a little more empty. The loss of his wife, the failure of his homestead in Texas, the bitterness that had taken root in his soul, it all led him here, to this forgotten corner of the world. As he walked towards the shack, a low, guttural bark sliced through the silence. A dog, old and matted with dirt, limped out from under the porch. Its ribs showed through its dull coat, and one of its ears was torn, a testament to a life of hard knocks. This, too, was part of the inheritance. Silas had mentioned Rusty, a good-for-nothing mutt, in his last letter. Ethan felt a pang of shared misery. He, too, was a good-for-nothing with a broken spirit. "Well, old-timer," Ethan muttered, his voice a rasp from disuse. "Looks like it's just you and me." The dog, Rusty, stopped a few feet away, its tail giving a weak wag. Its eyes, the color of weak tea, held a surprising intelligence, a flicker of something not yet extinguished. Ethan grabbed a tin bowl from the shack, filled it with water from his canteen, and placed it on the ground. Rusty didn't move immediately. He sniffed cautiously, then lapped at the water with a desperate thirst. Ethan spent the rest of the day in a grim assessment. The roof of the shack was full of holes, the well was a dry hole of despair, and the corral fence was held together by faith and a few rotting posts. There was nothing here, no future, no hope. He was ready to pack up and ride out at dawn, leaving the ghost of his uncle and the broken ranch behind. As night fell, a chill settled in, a stark contrast to the day's heat. Ethan sat by a small fire, eating a meager dinner of jerky and hardtack. Rusty sat a respectful distance away, his head resting on his paws, watching him. The old dog's presence was a quiet anchor in the vast emptiness. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel completely alone. He tossed a piece of jerky to Rusty. The dog caught it mid-air, a flash of the hunter it once was, and devoured it. As he finished, Rusty let out a sigh, a soft, human-like sound of contentment, and then slowly curled up on the hard-packed dirt, his rhythmic breathing a comforting counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Ethan, watching him, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, not happiness, but a faint, almost forgotten sense of responsibility. He wasn't just abandoning a ranch, he was abandoning a living thing that had nowhere else to go. The thought of leaving felt wrong. Something shifted inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could stay a little longer. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of soft whining. Rusty was standing a few feet from his bedroll, his tail thumping against the dirt. The dog's eyes were fixed on him, an urgent plea in their depths. Ethan, groggy and annoyed, tried to shoo him away. "Go on, boy. What's wrong with you?" But Rusty didn't relent. He trotted to the edge of the property, looked back at Ethan and barked again. It was a peculiar bark, not one of aggression or fear, but of insistence. Ethan, his curiosity piqued, grabbed his rifle and followed. Rusty led him to a small, isolated rise on the western edge of the property, a patch of land even more desolate than the rest. The dog began sniffing a specific spot, its head low to the ground. Then with a sudden, determined yelp, it began to dig. Dirt flew, and the dog worked with a frantic energy Ethan hadn't seen before. "What's got into you?" Ethan mumbled, but the dog ignored him, digging deeper and deeper. A few minutes later, Rusty hit something with a dull thud. He whined excitedly and looked back at Ethan, his eyes bright with triumph. Ethan, intrigued, knelt down and brushed the dirt away. He saw the corner of a metal box, rusted and caked with mud. He grabbed a pickaxe from the saddlebag on Ghost and began to carefully unearth the box. The work was slow and painstaking, and the midday sun beat down on his back. When the box was finally free, he saw that it was a strong box, the kind a bank would use. A heavy lock, though corroded, still held it shut. Using the pickaxe, Ethan pried at the lock. It was a stubborn thing, but after several forceful blows, it snapped with a sharp crack. He lifted the heavy lid, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, packed tightly and wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of gold coins and bundles of paper. He pulled one of the bundles out, his hands trembling. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a handful of gold double-eagle coins, each one glinting under the sun. He ran his calloused thumb over the face of the coins, the weight and coldness a foreign sensation. Then he looked at the papers. They were stock certificates and bonds, their value stamped on the front. He looked closer at the dates. They were old, but they were signed and sealed, a clear indication of their value. Ethan sat back on his heels, the dust swirling around him, his mind reeling. There was no way to know the exact amount, but he knew this much. It was a fortune. More money than he had ever seen in his life, more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. It was enough to buy a dozen ranches, enough to live a life of ease, enough to leave the bitterness of the past behind forever. He looked at Rusty, who was now panting happily beside him, his tail wagging furiously. The old dog, the good-for-nothing mutt, had led him to this. A strange, almost holy silence descended on them. The heat, the dust, the loneliness of Dry Creek. For a moment, it all seemed to fade away, replaced by the impossible blinding hope of a new future. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, was a collection of dusty wooden buildings huddled together like tired old men. Its name was a bitter irony, a promise of salvation in a world that offered only struggle. Ethan, now a man burdened by an unbelievable secret, rode into town with a new urgency. He needed supplies, and he needed a way to verify the value of the treasure. The general store was the heart of the town, run by a woman named Sarah Jensen. She was in her late 30s, with an intelligent face and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her hands, though small, were strong from years of lifting crates and mending tools. She looked up from the ledger she was balancing as Ethan pushed open the creaky door. "You're the Miller boy, aren't you?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. "Heard you inherited your uncle's place. Sorry for your loss." Ethan nodded. He wasn't much for company. Sarah's gaze lingered on him, taking in the tired lines around his eyes and the guarded set of his jaw. Nobody on that ranch was. Silas was a hard man. Still, a man's land is a man's land. Ethan bought sacks of flour, beans and oats, and a few tins of meat. He also bought a new shovel and a padlock for the shed. As he was about to pay, he hesitated. "You know anything about old stocks and bonds?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. "I've seen a few. My father used to invest. Why do you ask?" Ethan pulled a single, carefully wrapped bond from his pocket. "Just something my uncle left. I'm trying to figure out if it's worth anything." Sarah took the paper and examined it closely. She noted the dates, the seals, and the signatures. Her eyes widened slightly. "This is from the Santa Fe and Pacific Railroad. It's a gold-backed bond. If it's real, and it looks like it is, it's worth a small fortune." She looked at Ethan with a new, speculative glint in her eyes. "Where did you find this?" "In a box," Ethan said, a little too quickly. "Buried on the ranch." Sarah handed the bond back to him, her expression unreadable. "You keep this close, Mr. Miller. This kind of thing can make a man rich, and it can also get him killed." The warning sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He paid for his supplies and left the store, the weight of the treasure now a physical presence on his shoulders. The world, which had seemed so empty just days ago, was now filled with a new kind of danger. Back at the ranch, as the sun began to set, Ethan looked at the old shack and the broken fences, but this time he saw not a wasteland, but a fortress. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a man with something to protect, and for the first time in his life, he was willing to fight for it. The silence of the desert was no longer just empty. It was listening. Jeremiah Thorne wasn't a man. He was a force of nature, a predator with a charming smile and a heart of pure malice. He and his gang, known as the Desert Coyotes, had a reputation for leaving a trail of blood and despair wherever they went. They were ruthless, cunning, and without a single shred of decency. Thorne had a network of informers, and one of them, a crooked saloon owner in Redemption Creek, had heard a whisper about a lonely rancher asking questions about old bonds. The whisper became a rumor, and the rumor became a conviction in Thorne's mind. Something of great value was on that ranch. Thorne and his two closest enforcers, the brutish Silas Bear Jones and the wiry, cunning Snake Jackson, rode out of town a few days after Ethan's visit. Thorne's eyes, cold as a winter moon, scanned the horizon. "A fool and his money are soon parted," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "And this fool doesn't even know what he has yet." Ethan, meanwhile, was working with a new fervor. He began to repair the shack, mending the roof and securing the windows. He shored up the corral and began to dig a new well, his body aching but his spirit renewed. Rusty was always by his side, a faithful shadow watching him work. One afternoon, as Ethan was hauling a bucket of water from the new well, he saw 3 riders on the horizon. They were moving with a purpose, a cloud of dust trailing behind them. His hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the shack wall. The men dismounted at the edge of his property, their posture casual, but their eyes hard. "Heard you got yourself a little piece of land, Mr. Miller," Thorne said, his voice a smooth rumble. He had the kind of face that could be trusted, a face that hid a snake's bite. "It's mine," Ethan replied, his voice flat. He didn't like the way this man was looking at him. "We're just passing through," Thorne said, his eyes scanning the property, looking for any sign of a hidden fortune. "Looking for some water. Heard you've got a new well." Ethan nodded towards the well, his hand still on the rifle. "Help yourself, and then be on your way." Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not very neighborly. We heard you found something valuable, something from your uncle's time." The blood in Ethan's veins turned to ice. He knew they weren't just passing through. He knew they were there for the treasure. "You heard wrong," he said, his hand tightening on the rifle. Thorne's smile vanished. "Don't lie to me, Miller. We know about the bonds. We know about the gold. Tell us where it is, and this can be over before anyone gets hurt." Rusty, who had been sitting calmly beside Ethan, let out a low growl. It was a sound full of warning, a deep and menacing rumble that startled Thorne. The dog's hackles were raised, and his eyes, usually so gentle, were now fixed on Thorne with a primal ferocity. Thorne's enforcer, Bear, took a step forward. "I'll shoot the mutt if you don't talk." "Touch him and I'll kill you," Ethan said, his voice a cold steel. The stalemate was broken by a distant gunshot. Thorne's men looked up, their focus momentarily broken. A rider was approaching in the distance. Thorne, seeing that his element of surprise was lost, grunted in frustration. "This isn't over, Miller," he said, his voice now a low hiss. "We'll be back." They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Ethan standing in the dust, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Rusty, who was now panting from the excitement, his tail giving a short, triumphant wag. The treasure was no longer just his secret. It was a beacon, drawing predators from the desert. The game had begun. After the encounter with Thorne's gang, Ethan knew he couldn't face them alone. He had to go back to Redemption Creek, not just for supplies, but for a plan. He rode Ghost back to town, the landscape a blur of worry and determination. He went straight to Sarah Jensen's store. She looked up from behind the counter, her eyes immediately going to the grim set of his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mr. Miller." "Worse," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "I've seen the desert coyotes. Jeremiah Thorne himself." Sarah's face went pale. "What did they want?" "They know," Ethan said simply. "They know about the treasure. They came to the ranch asking questions." Sarah grabbed a bottle of whiskey and a tin cup from behind the counter and poured him a small amount. "Drink this," she said. "Now tell me everything." As Ethan recounted the story, Sarah listened intently, her mind working furiously. She was not a woman to panic, she was a woman to plan. "Thorne's not going to give up," she said when he was done. "He's like a wolf with a scent. He'll keep coming back until he gets what he wants." "I know," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "I can't fight them on my own. I need help." "Help from who?" she asked. "Most people here would hand you over to Thorne for a few dollars." "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice full of frustration. "That's why I came to you. You're smart. You know this land. You know these people." Sarah looked at him, a long and thoughtful gaze. She saw not just the broken man who had inherited a junk farm, but a man who had fought to survive, a man who had protected his dog, a man who was now willing to fight for his future. She saw a flicker of the good man he could be. "My father used to say that the only thing a man can truly call his own is his word," she said, "and the only thing worth fighting for is your life and your land." "Are you saying you'll help?" Ethan asked, a spark of hope in his eyes. "I'm saying we're in this together," she said, her voice firm. "Thorne and his kind, they're not just a threat to you. They're a threat to this whole town. I won't let them take over." Over the next few days, they worked on a plan. Sarah, with her knowledge of the surrounding area, pointed out hidden trails and potential ambush points. She helped him reinforce the shack, turning it into a makeshift fortress. She taught him how to set simple traps and how to use the terrain to his advantage. Their time together, filled with the serious business of survival, also gave rise to a slow, tender connection. They talked about their pasts, their failures, their fears. Ethan found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't to anyone in years. He saw her not just as an ally, but as a partner. Their fight was not just against a ruthless gang. It was a battle for their home, for their future, and for the fragile hope of a new life together. Thorne was a patient man, but he was not a forgiving one. He let a week pass, giving Ethan a false sense of security before launching his first assault. Under the cover of a moonless night, the desert coyotes approached Dry Creek Ranch from the south, their movements silent and swift, but they were not as silent as Rusty. The old dog's ears, though torn, were sharper than any man's. He let out a low growl, waking Ethan from his sleep. Ethan grabbed his rifle and peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. He saw 3 shadows moving towards the shack. "Sarah was right," he whispered to himself. "They're here." Ethan woke Sarah, who was sleeping on a cot in the corner, her own rifle by her side. They took up positions at opposite ends of the shack. The first gunshot ripped through the night, a flash of orange followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet splintered the wooden wall, and Ethan returned fire. The exchange of gunfire was brief but intense. Thorne's men were experienced, but they were also unprepared for a fortified position and an opponent who was ready for them. The shack held, and Ethan's shots, though not hitting their targets, were enough to keep the coyotes at bay. Suddenly, a Molotov cocktail, a bottle of whiskey with a burning rag, flew through the air and crashed against the side of the shack. The old wood caught fire instantly, the flames spreading quickly in the dry night air. "We have to get out!" Sarah yelled. They grabbed their bags, their rifles, and a bewildered Rusty, and scrambled out the back door, just as the flames engulfed the front of the shack. They ran for the hills, using the darkness and the rocky terrain as cover. From a safe distance, they watched as their home burned, a beacon of fire against the black night. Ethan's heart sank, a bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. He had failed, but as the fire died down, a new kind of resolve hardened in him. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the dying embers, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. He looked at Rusty, who was panting softly beside him, his gaze fixed on the smoking remains of the shack. "They think they've won," Ethan said, his voice low and full of menace. "But all they did was burn a pile of wood. The treasure is still safe. And now they've made this personal." The loss of the ranch was a blow, but it also stripped away the last remnants of Ethan's past life. He was no longer fighting for a piece of property. He was fighting for his life, for Sarah's life, and for the right to a future free from fear. With their home destroyed, Ethan and Sarah became fugitives in their own land. They hid in a small, hidden canyon a few miles from the ranch, a secret Sarah had known about since she was a girl. The canyon had a small spring and was surrounded by high, rocky walls, making it a perfect temporary refuge. They were no longer just defending, they were planning a counterattack. Sarah's knowledge of the land, coupled with Ethan's skill with a rifle and his newfound courage, made them a formidable pair. They had to be cunning, to use the land and their knowledge to their advantage. Thorn, meanwhile, was enraged. He had assumed that burning the shack would force Miller to reveal the treasure's location, but the fool had escaped, and with him, his fortune. Thorn was now more determined than ever to find him. He and his gang began to scour the desert, riding through every canyon and searching every cave. Ethan and Sarah, hidden in their canyon, watched their movements, learning their patterns. They set up traps along the main trails, not to kill, but to slow them down, to frustrate them, to turn their hunt into a wild goose chase. One afternoon, Bear, Thorn's enforcer, got his leg caught in a snare, a simple but effective trap designed to hold him but not hurt him. He was a big man, and his enraged roars echoed through the canyons. Thorn, fearing a trap, had to free him, losing precious time and growing more frustrated with each passing hour. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sarah found an old mining cave, a place where their supplies could be stored and where they could sleep without fear of being found. Rusty was their sentry, his sharp senses a constant source of security. Their bond grew stronger in the face of danger. The simple act of sharing a meal, of sitting by a small fire and talking about their lives, of the quiet comfort of their shared silence, it all created a deep and unbreakable connection. They were no longer two lonely souls. They were a unit, a family forged in the fires of adversity. The desert, once a symbol of loneliness, was now their shield, their ally, and the battlefield where they would make their final stand. Thorn, in a fit of rage and desperation, decided to change tactics. He sent a message to Ethan through a crooked prospector, a note tied to a rock. The message was simple and brutal. "Meet me at Lone Star Peak in 3 days. Come alone, or your girlfriend dies." The threat was a chilling reality check. Sarah's face went white when she read it. "He's not bluffing," she said. "He'll do it. You have to go." "I'm not going to let him get to you," Ethan said, his voice low and firm. "This is my fight too," Sarah replied. "We'll go together. We'll use the land against him." They spent the next 2 days preparing. They gathered their weapons, planned their route, and decided on a strategy. Lone Star Peak was a treacherous, rocky mountain, a place where a man could easily lose his way or his life. It was a perfect place for an ambush. On the 3rd day, as the sun began to rise, they made their way to the peak. Ethan and Sarah rode together on Ghost, the old horse a silent, steadfast companion. Rusty ran ahead, his tail held high, a confident stride in his step. He was a different dog now, no longer the broken creature Ethan had found under the porch. He was a protector, a warrior. When they reached the peak, Thorn and his gang were waiting. They were silhouetted against the morning sky, their figures menacing and dark. "I see you didn't come alone, Miller," Thorn sneered, his eyes filled with a cruel amusement. "Always a pleasure to see a coward bring a woman to a man's fight." "She's more of a man than you'll ever be," Ethan retorted, his hand on his rifle. The standoff was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats. Thorn, however, had an ace up his sleeve. He pointed to a small outcropping of rocks. Ethan saw two more of Thorn's men, one holding a bundle of sticks of dynamite. "I've got dynamite," Thorn said, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "You show me where the treasure is, and I'll let you live. You try to fight, and I'll blow this whole mountain to hell." Ethan's mind raced. He had to stall to find an opening. He looked at Sarah, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked at Rusty, who was now standing on a high rock, his eyes fixed on Thorn's gang. "What do you need a treasure for, Thorn?" Ethan said, trying to buy time. "You've got a whole gang of men to do your bidding. You're a powerful man." "A powerful man is a rich man, Miller," Thorn replied, "and a rich man doesn't have to listen to the likes of you." Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, but it wasn't from Ethan's rifle. It was from Sarah. She had aimed not at Thorn, but at the man with the dynamite, a calculated shot that was meant to create a distraction. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the canyon. Thorn's men, startled, turned their attention to Sarah. In that instant, Ethan took his shot. He fired at Thorn's arm, the bullet tearing through his shoulder. Thorn let out a cry of pain, his rifle clattering to the ground. The rest of the gang, surprised and disoriented, scattered. Ethan and Sarah used the confusion to their advantage. They fired on the retreating gang, not to kill, but to incapacitate, to show them that their reign of terror was over. Bear, Thorn's enforcer, was a different story. He charged at Ethan, a crazed look in his eyes. But before he could reach him, Rusty, the old, good-for-nothing mutt, launched himself at the giant's legs. Bear, caught off guard, stumbled and fell, his rifle flying from his grasp. Ethan, seeing his chance, delivered a swift kick to the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. Thorn, wounded and defeated, looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical thing. "You won, Miller," he rasped, "but I'll be back. I'll always be back." The battle was over, the silence returned, but this time it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of victory. With Thorn and his gang defeated, the word spread like wildfire through Redemption Creek. The townspeople, who had been living in fear of the coyotes, hailed Ethan and Sarah as heroes. The sheriff, a man who had long been afraid to cross Thorn, rode out to the peak and took the gang into custody. The town was safe. With the treasure now his, Ethan began to rebuild Dry Creek Ranch. He hired local hands, men who had lost their farms to drought and despair. He used the gold to buy a new herd of cattle, to repair the fences, and to build a new, bigger and more beautiful house. He had a new well dug, one that promised a life-giving flow of water. Sarah was by his side every step of the way, not just as a partner, but as a co-owner of the ranch. Her love for the land and her business acumen were invaluable. They built their future together, brick by brick, fence post by fence post. Their life was a testament to the power of human resilience and the strength of an unbreakable bond. They were no longer two broken souls, they were two whole people, and they had found their home in each other. Rusty, the old dog who had started it all, was now a king. He had his own bed, his own food bowl, and the endless affection of his two owners. He had a new swagger in his step, a new light in his eyes. He was no longer just an old mutt. He was the reason for their good fortune, the heart of the new Dry Creek Ranch. The ghost of Silas and the bitterness of the past were finally gone. Dry Creek was no longer a place of despair. It was a place of new beginnings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch of their new house, hand in hand. The air was cool and filled with the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the new trees they had planted. Rusty, old but still full of life, lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, his tail giving a lazy wag. "It's a good life, isn't it?" Sarah said, her voice soft. "It is," Ethan said, his gaze sweeping over the land that was now a testament to their love and hard work. He had come here with nothing, a man haunted by his past, and now he had everything. He had a home, a purpose, and a partner. He looked at Sarah, a woman who had seen the darkness in him and had chosen to stand beside him anyway. He looked at Rusty, the dog who had taught him that even in the most desolate of places, a treasure could be found. "You know," Ethan said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I always thought the treasure was the gold, but it wasn't. It was him." He gestured to Rusty with his chin. "And it was you." Sarah's hand tightened in his. They sat in comfortable silence, their hearts full, the vast Arizona desert no longer a lonely expanse, but a shared home, a symbol of their future.